Long after midnight, when history stops shouting and starts whispering, this story opens quietly, inviting you into dust, gun smoke, and unanswered questions, where justice feels optional, money feels louder, and silence often tells the truth better than facts alone. Many listen quietly here, night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. It is dangerously easy to romanticize the American Wild West, so easy that we rarely notice when imagination replaces memory. We picture endless deserts, glowing under a forgiving sun, lone riders frozen against the horizon, revolvers catching the light like symbols of freedom instead of instruments of fear. In films, justice is punctual and dramatic. The sheriff steps into the street. The outlaw narrows his eyes. Even the wind seems polite enough to pause for the final gunshot. Reality, however, kept a different clock entirely, one that did not care for symbolism or timing. Justice did not arrive on cue, and often it did not arrive at all. In much of the Wild West, law did not arrive dramatically. It arrived late, tired, underfunded, and often outgunned. Sometimes it did not arrive at all. And when law shows up late to a party filled with violence, greed, and desperation, it rarely gets to decide the rules. That gap, that long, uncomfortable silence between crime and consequence, is where something strange began to grow. Something practical, something deeply American, and something just a little unhinged. Bounty hunting. Not the heroic kind, not the cinematic kind, the real kind. The kind that existed because nobody else could or would do the job. The kind that asked a very simple question and gave it an even simpler answer. If justice won't come, how much are you willing to pay someone to chase it down? The Wild West was not lawless because people hated rules. It was lawless because rules require infrastructure, courts, jails, judges, paperwork, salaries, and above all, time. The frontier had none of these in reliable supply. Towns appeared overnight built around gold, railroads, or sheer optimism. Populations exploded, then vanished just as quickly. Crime followed opportunity, as it always does, but accountability lagged far behind. So communities improvised. If you couldn't maintain a police force, you hired one temporarily. If you couldn't track a criminal across state lines, you outsourced the problem. If you couldn't afford a legal system, you put a price on a person. It sounds crude, because it was. Wanted posters went up on saloon walls and courthouse doors. Names were printed in thick ink. Faces were sketched from memory, sometimes generously, sometimes not. And underneath the most important line of all, the reward. A number that quietly declared how much a human life, or at least their capture, was worth this week. Dead or alive was not a dramatic flourish. It was a logistical shortcut. Alive meant transport, guards, paperwork, witnesses, trials. Alive meant complications. Dead meant closure. A body could not escape. A corpse did not sue. And so while the phrase offered two options, everyone understood which one was preferred. This was not justice in the philosophical sense. It was problem solving with a gun. And into this system stepped the bounty hunter, a figure born not from heroism, but from necessity and profit. They were not police, they were not soldiers, they were not even criminals, at least not officially. They existed in a gray zone so wide you could get lost in it. Freelancers of violence, contractors of consequence, no uniform, no standardized training, no moral code that could be reliably enforced. Just an agreement, bring them back, and get paid. Or don't bring them back, as long as the problem went away. There is something darkly ironic about how quickly society accepted this arrangement. People who distrusted centralized government were perfectly comfortable outsourcing lethal authority to whoever looked confident holding a rifle. It turns out skepticism of power often ends exactly where fear begins. And fear was abundant. The frontier was loud with it. Fear of strangers, fear of bandits, fear of losing everything you owned in one bad night. Fear that if someone wronged you, there would be no one to call, no one to help, no one to care. So when someone said, "I'll handle it," and asked only for money in return, the deal felt reasonable, even comforting. Of course, this system came with side effects, severe ones. When you turn justice into a commodity, you attract people who are very good at chasing money. When you reward speed over accuracy, you encourage mistakes. And when you blur the line between legal authority and personal ambition, you create a profession where conscience is optional. But none of that was obvious at first. Or perhaps it was, and people simply chose not to look too closely. After all, the alternative was chaos. Or worse, doing nothing. Late at night, when saloons emptied and the streets grew quiet, townspeople slept, knowing that somewhere out there, someone might be hunting on their behalf. That thought was both reassuring and unsettling, like hiring a guard dog you've never met and hoping it understands the difference between intruders and neighbors. And this is where the madness truly begins. Not with gunfights or legends, but with normalization. The quiet moment when a society collectively shrugs and says, "This will have to do." Because once you accept bounty hunting as a solution, you accept everything that comes with it. The shortcuts, the abuses, the accidental killings, the intentional ones disguised as accidents. You accept that truth will sometimes be less important than results, and results will always be measured in speed. You accept that justice may arrive, but it will not knock. There is a certain dry humor in all of this, if you allow yourself to see it. A civilization built on ideals of liberty and fairness, temporarily powered by handwritten posters and armed freelancers. A place where the rule of law was upheld by people who operated entirely outside it. It's almost impressive, almost. And yet it worked, just enough to survive, which is perhaps the most dangerous kind of success, the kind that doesn't solve the problem but convinces everyone to stop asking questions. So when we talk about the madness of Wild West bounty hunting, we are not talking about a few reckless gunmen chasing criminals through the desert. We are talking about a social experiment conducted under pressure, fueled by fear, and paid for in blood. An experiment that answered one urgent question while quietly creating dozens more. Because once law arrives late, someone else will always arrive first. Who was the bounty hunter? Hero or paid predator? If you grew up on movies, television, or video games, the bounty hunter feels familiar. A lone figure, quiet, efficient, morally complicated, but secretly noble. Someone who operates outside the system because the system is too slow, too corrupt, too soft. They do what others cannot, or will not. They are dangerous but necessary. a reluctant hero with a gun and a personal code. Now take a breath, lower your expectations, and gently set that image on fire, because the real bounty hunter of the Wild West was rarely glamorous, often desperate, and almost never noble. They were not knights without armor. They were not vigilantes with tragic backstories. Most of them were simply people who realized there was money to be made chasing other people, and that the frontier offered very few questions and even fewer background checks. There was no academy for bounty hunters, no standardized training, no oath to protect the innocent, no psychological screening to ensure they wouldn't panic, overreact, or enjoy the violence just a little too much. You did not graduate into this profession. You drifted into it, one job at a time, one wanted poster at a time, sometimes by accident, sometimes because every other option had already failed. In many cases, a bounty hunter was just a former soldier who couldn't stop fighting, or a failed farmer who needed cash fast, or a gambler who finally realized the odds were better when the deck was loaded with bullets. Some were lawmen who had quit or been fired. Some were criminals themselves, temporarily standing on the correct side of the poster. The line was thin, and it moved constantly. What united them was not ideology, it was opportunity. And this is where the comparison with sheriffs becomes almost painfully ironic. The sheriff, at least in theory, represented the law. He wore a badge. He answered to a town council or a county government. He had a jail to maintain, paperwork to file, and a salary that barely covered his boots. His authority stopped at the edge of his jurisdiction, and his power depended on public trust. The bounty hunter, on the other hand, answered only to the reward. No fixed territory, no voters, no supervisors. If someone posted money for a capture, that was authorization enough. In modern terms, the sheriff was a poorly paid government employee. The bounty hunter was a freelancer with performance-based compensation. And the performance metric was simple. Did the target stop being a problem? Alive was acceptable. Dead was efficient. From a purely economic perspective, bounty hunting made an uncomfortable kind of sense. Towns were poor, governments were stretched thin, crime was mobile, criminals crossed borders faster than paperwork ever could. Hiring someone who specialized in pursuit felt logical. Even modern societies outsource tasks all the time: security, debt collection, military contracts. The difference is mostly in how politely we describe it. But economics does not explain why the public tolerated the darker side of this profession. Why did communities accept men who operated with such vague authority, such uneven skill, and such flexible morality? Because fear lowers standards. When your town has been robbed 3 times in a month, you stop asking whether the solution is perfect. You ask whether it works. When the person who shot your neighbor might return, you are less interested in due process and more interested in distance. Far distance. Permanent distance. Bounty hunters offered emotional relief, the promise that someone, somewhere, was actively hunting the threat instead of waiting for it to return. That promise mattered more than how it was fulfilled. And there was another reason, one that is less flattering but far more human. Bounty hunters allowed communities to keep their hands clean. Violence was outsourced. Responsibility was displaced. If something went wrong, if the wrong person was killed or captured, it was easy to say, well, that was the bounty hunter's doing. Justice could remain abstract while blood remained someone else's problem. This arrangement produced a strange social illusion. The bounty hunter felt powerful but was rarely respected, needed but not trusted, praised in success, quietly disowned in failure. They lived on the edge of towns, in cheap rooms, moving constantly, a necessary discomfort. Like a bad smell, everyone pretended not to notice as long as it stayed outside. And yet popular culture would later transform them into icons, strong, silent, principled. This transformation says less about history and more about our appetite for simplified narratives. We prefer our violence clean, our moral compromises justified, our hired guns introspective rather than opportunistic. The real bounty hunter did not brood over ethics at sunset. He calculated risk, he calculated distance, he calculated how many bullets he had left and how many he might need. His code, if he had one, was practical. Survive, get paid, move on. You don't need a degree, someone once joked. Just nerve, a gun, and the ability not to panic when someone panics first. It was meant as humor, but it captured the truth disturbingly well. Competence was optional, confidence was mandatory, and mistakes were final. This is where the myth begins to fracture completely. Because without training, without oversight, without clear legal boundaries, bounty hunting became wildly inconsistent. One hunter might carefully track a suspect for weeks, ensuring identity before acting. Another might rely on hearsay, coincidence, or convenience. If a man vaguely resembled the sketch on the poster and happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, that could be enough. Accuracy competed directly with speed, and speed usually won. This wasn't because bounty hunters were uniquely cruel. It was because the system rewarded outcomes, not processes. No one paid extra for certainty. No one offered bonuses for restraint. The poster did not say, "Bring solid evidence." It said, "Bring him." So society got what it paid for. And still the profession persisted, because despite its flaws, it filled a vacuum, because alternatives were slow, expensive, or non-existent, because even a dangerous solution feels better than helplessness. Late at night, when the stories of botched captures circulated quietly through saloons, people would shake their heads, mutter about bad luck, and order another drink. The same walls that held wanted posters also held laughter. Humans are very good at compartmentalizing discomfort, especially when it benefits them. And there is one more uncomfortable truth to confront. Bounty hunters didn't just chase criminals. They chased the idea of control in a world that felt uncontrollable. In a frontier defined by instability, they offered the illusion that someone, somewhere, was actively restoring balance. Even if that balance was crude, even if it was temporary. They were not heroes. They were not monsters. They were symptoms. Symptoms of a society growing faster than its laws, of justice struggling to keep pace with expansion, of communities willing to accept morally questionable solutions as long as they delivered immediate relief. So when we ask whether the bounty hunter was a hero or a hired predator, the answer is deeply unsatisfying. They were neither and often both, depending on the day, the target, and the size of the reward. They were shaped less by character than by circumstance, less by values than by incentives. And that is what makes them truly unsettling. Not their violence, but their normality. The ease with which ordinary people stepped into extraordinary authority simply because no one else was available to stop them. But this profession, strange as it was, did not emerge out of nothing. It was not an accident of personality. It was the result of systems colliding, failing, and improvising under pressure. And to understand that, we have to look deeper, back past the individuals, back past the myths, back to the mechanisms that made turning human lives into line items feel reasonable in the first place. The bounty system. How much was justice worth? By the time bounty hunters became a familiar presence on the frontier, the system that fed them had already settled into place. It did not arrive with a constitution, a charter, or even much debate. It arrived quietly, nailed to wooden walls, pinned behind bars, and pasted onto courthouse doors, with hands that shook more from urgency than ceremony. The wanted poster was not merely an announcement. It was a contract, a price tag, a confession that justice had been reduced to something measurable, negotiable, and dangerously flexible. At first glance, the system seemed almost reasonable. A crime occurred. The suspect fled. The local sheriff lacked the manpower, jurisdiction, or resources to pursue them. So a reward was offered. Anyone who brought the fugitive back would be compensated. In theory, this was efficiency. In practice, it was monetized desperation. The wanted poster itself became an artifact of the Wild West, instantly recognizable and strangely iconic. Thick lettering, stark warnings, a rough sketch of a face that might or might not resemble the person in question. And beneath it all, the number. $50, $100. Sometimes more if the crime had touched nerves or threatened economic stability. That number did something subtle and irreversible. It converted a human being into a calculation. Once a price was assigned, priorities shifted. The question was no longer what happened, but is it worth the risk? No longer is this the right person, but is this close enough? The system did not encourage careful investigation. It encouraged initiative. An initiative, when paired with money and guns, has a tendency to sprint past nuance. Money, law, and violence intertwined in ways that felt practical at the time and grotesque in hindsight. The law provided the justification, money provided the motivation, and violence provided the resolution. Each element reinforced the others, creating a cycle that was difficult to slow and impossible to fully control. The more rewards were offered, the more bounty hunters appeared. The more bounty hunters appeared, the more aggressively rewards were pursued. And the faster those pursuits became, the less room there was for correction. The phrase dead or alive deserves special attention because it encapsulates the moral shortcut at the heart of the system. Officially, it offered flexibility. Unofficially, it offered permission. Alive required effort. Dead required confirmation. A body did not argue. A corpse did not claim mistaken identity. A corpse did not require guards, transport, food, or a trial that might expose errors. Alive is complicated. Dead is tidy. No one wrote that on the poster, but everyone understood it. This preference was not always explicit, but it was deeply embedded. Rewards were rarely reduced for dead captures. Sometimes they were paid faster. Sometimes questions were quietly skipped. In a frontier obsessed with efficiency, death was simply the most efficient outcome. It closed cases. It freed resources. It satisfied fear. And the higher the reward, the more aggressively that logic was applied. High bounties attracted competition. Competition encouraged speed. Speed punished caution. When multiple hunters chased the same prize, the incentive was no longer to be correct, but to be first. Verification became a luxury. Suspicion became sufficient. And resemblance, however loose, became dangerously persuasive. It did not take long for people to notice a grim pattern. The higher the bounty, the higher the body count. Not always the target's body. Sometimes an accomplice, sometimes a bystander. Sometimes someone whose greatest crime was sharing a similar hat, a similar name, or a similar silhouette at the wrong moment. Mistakes were not rare anomalies. They were structural risks. The system did not collapse under these errors because it was never designed to prevent them. It was designed to resolve problems quickly. Accuracy was desirable, but not required. And when errors did surface, they were often absorbed quietly. Compensation was rare. Accountability was rarer. After all, who would you arrest? The bounty hunter who followed the poster? The town that paid him? The law that looked the other way? It was easier to move on. The most unsettling aspect of the bounty system was not its violence, but its normalization. People became accustomed to seeing faces and prices side by side. They learned to see life as conditional, worth more under certain circumstances, worth less if inconvenient, worth exactly the number printed beneath a sketch. Children grew up reading these posters. Travelers scanned them casually. Conversations drifted toward speculation. That one's worth a lot. That one won't last long. The language of the marketplace seeped into the language of morality. And sometimes the system got it wrong from the beginning. There are documented cases of individuals being falsely accused, misidentified, or deliberately framed. A grudge, a rumor, or a convenient scapegoat could become lethal once transformed into a reward. On the frontier, reputation traveled faster than evidence. And once a name was printed, it gained a momentum that was difficult to stop. Imagine realizing that somewhere behind you, your face hangs on a wall, paired with a number that tells strangers how much your absence is worth. Imagine knowing that people who have never met you, never heard your side, are actively searching for you with lethal authority, and that the system encourages them to act before thinking too hard. That knowledge changes a person. It pushes them into hiding, into paranoia, into constant motion. In some cases, it pushed them into actual crime simply to survive the pursuit. The system did not merely punish wrongdoing, it created it. And yet, from the perspective of towns and territories, the bounty system felt necessary. It externalized risk. It transformed an unpredictable threat into a manageable expense. Instead of asking how to build sustainable law enforcement, communities asked how much they could afford to make a problem disappear. This mindset spread easily because it worked just often enough. Criminals were caught, some were returned alive, others were never heard from again. The posters came down, the fear subsided, and the system earned another quiet vote of confidence. There is a bitter irony here. The bounty system was meant to compensate for weak institutions, but it ultimately discouraged their development. Why invest in courts, training, and oversight when temporary solutions appeared to function? Why build slow justice when fast justice kept the streets quiet? Late at night, when the wind rattled the posters against the walls, the system felt less like order and more like a reminder of unresolved chaos. Justice hung in public view, priced and exposed, inviting anyone desperate or ambitious enough to take a swing at it. The mild humor in all of this lies in how blunt the arrangement was. No speeches, no illusions of purity, just paper, ink, and money. This person is a problem. Solve it. In an age that prides itself on procedural complexity, there is something almost refreshingly honest about such a transaction. Almost. But honesty does not equal fairness. And efficiency does not equal morality. When money enters the equation, ethics tend to take a break. Not permanently, just long enough for irreversible decisions to be made. The bounty system did not ask hunters to be cruel, but it rewarded them when they were fast. It did not instruct them to be careless, but it paid them whether they were or not, and so the frontier lived with a system that worked until it didn't, protected until it harmed, and delivered justice that was always conditional. Justice, it turned out, was worth exactly what someone was willing to pay. No more, no less. And once that precedent was set, it became very difficult to remember what justice was supposed to cost in the first place. The hunts without rules. Once money, fear, and authority blended together, the frontier entered a new phase. This was the phase where structure quietly dissolved, where the thin lines that still separated law from chaos finally blurred beyond recognition. The bounty system had created incentives, and bounty hunters had stepped forward to claim them. What followed were not investigations, but hunts. And hunts, by their nature, do not pause for reflection. These pursuits rarely began with warrants. Warrants required judges, paperwork, and something resembling due process. Most frontier towns had none of those readily available. Even when warrants existed, they often stopped at jurisdictional borders that criminals crossed without hesitation. Bounty hunters did not concern themselves with such limitations. The poster was enough, the reward was authorization. Everything else was considered optional. There was no formal arrest. There was capture, or there was removal. There was no trial before the hunt began. Guilt was assumed by ink and public display. The trial, if it happened at all, came afterward, and only if the target survived long enough to demand one. Responsibility was diffused so thoroughly that it practically evaporated. If something went wrong, everyone could plausibly deny being the one truly in charge. This absence of accountability changed behavior quickly. Bounty hunters became whatever the moment required them to be. One day they were detectives gathering rumors in saloons, piecing together movements from half-remembered conversations. The next day they were soldiers, riding hard through hostile terrain, fingers close to triggers, nerves stretched thin. And when patience ran out, they became executioners, deciding in seconds what courts were meant to decide over weeks. All of this happened without oversight. No one reviewed their methods. No one audited their mistakes. Success was measured by silence. If a name stopped circulating, if a threat stopped returning, the hunt was considered complete. The frontier rewarded decisiveness, not deliberation. Some of the most famous pursuits of the era illustrate just how fragile this system was. In several cases, bounty hunters tracked targets across multiple territories, relying on rumor chains that grew less accurate with every retelling. Descriptions shifted, names were misspelled, ages changed, and yet the chase continued, fueled by sunk costs and pride. Once a hunter had invested time and danger into a pursuit, turning back felt like failure. Confirmation bias became lethal. Every sighting reinforced belief. Every coincidence was interpreted as proof. The longer the hunt lasted, the less likely anyone was to question whether it should have begun at all, and when the confrontation finally came, it was often sudden, chaotic, and irreversible. There were no arrests shouted from a safe distance. There were ambushes, doorways kicked open in the night, shots fired before explanations could be offered. In some cases, the wrong man died with no idea why he was being hunted. If the bounty hunter survived, the story usually ended there. The system had no mechanism for rewind, no appeals process for the dead, no serious effort to trace error back to its source. The frontier moved forward carrying its mistakes like unmarked graves. There is a particular chill in realizing how normalized this became. Communities learned to live with uncertainty. They accepted that sometimes the wrong person would suffer, and that this was an unfortunate but tolerable cost of safety. The phrase collateral damage had not yet been coined, but the concept was already in use. Dark humor flourished in this environment because humor is how people cope with moral discomfort. If you catch the wrong man, someone might joke, apologize later. And then with a shrug that carried far more meaning, they would add, if you kill the wrong man, well, the sentence rarely needed finishing. The lack of clear rules also attracted a particular type of individual, people who enjoyed ambiguity, people who were comfortable improvising violence, people who liked being the final authority in situations where no one could easily challenge them. For these hunters, the frontier was not just an opportunity, it was a playground. They could interrogate without witnesses, pursue without permission, kill without trial. And if the outcome aligned loosely enough with public expectations, they would be praised rather than punished. Success covered sins remarkably well, but even those who did not seek abuse found themselves shaped by the system. Constant danger eroded patience. Repeated exposure to violence dulled empathy. The pressure to be first, to be effective, to be paid, pushed hunters toward shortcuts they might not have considered at the beginning. The line between necessity and convenience blurred, then disappeared. At night, alone with their thoughts, some bounty hunters reportedly struggled with what they had done. Others slept soundly. Both reactions were products of the same environment. When rules vanish, conscience becomes the only boundary, and conscience is notoriously inconsistent. The towns that benefited from these hunts rarely wanted to know details. They wanted outcomes. They wanted the fear to stop. They wanted normalcy to return. And if that normalcy was built on unexamined violence, it felt distant enough to ignore. This is how chaos becomes sustainable. Not because people celebrate it, but because they adapt to it. The frontier was filled with these quiet adaptations. Saloon keepers learned which questions not to ask. Clerks learned when to look away. Sheriffs learned which reports to file and which to misplace. Everyone learned that survival sometimes meant selective blindness. And yet, despite the brutality and randomness, these hunts began to generate legends, stories stripped of their messiest details, tales that emphasized courage and downplayed confusion. Over time, the narrative hardened into something almost admirable. Lone hunters outsmarting dangerous criminals, order restored through grit and resolve. The reality, of course, was less cinematic. Many hunts ended in confusion. Many involved targets who never had a fair chance to surrender. Many concluded with consequences that rippled outward, affecting families, towns, and futures that never appeared on wanted posters. The frontier did not lack justice because people were cruel. It lacked justice because justice requires patience, structure, and restraint. The hunts provided speed, improvisation, and finality. In an environment defined by urgency, those qualities were irresistible, and so the system continued. Each successful hunt reinforced the belief that this was simply how things had to be. Each failure was quietly buried beneath the next emergency. Over time, the extraordinary became routine. But within this chaos, something else began to form, a mythology. Certain bounty hunters stood out, not just for what they did, but for how often they survived doing it. Their names circulated, their reputations grew. Fear and admiration tangled together until they were impossible to separate. And of course, wherever chaos persists long enough, someone will learn how to thrive within it. The most notorious bounty hunters. Chaos, if left alone long enough, does something predictable. It creates specialists, not heroes in the traditional sense, but individuals who learn how to move through disorder with efficiency, confidence, and a disturbing level of comfort. By the height of the bounty hunting era, certain names began to surface repeatedly, not because they were officially recognized, but because they were effective, or at least effective enough to survive. These bounty hunters did not become famous by accident. Reputation on the frontier was a currency almost as valuable as money. A hunter known for finishing jobs attracted higher bounties. A hunter known for brutality attracted fear, which often shortened pursuits. A hunter known for relentlessness attracted both admiration and quiet resentment. Fame, like everything else in the Wild West, was earned the hard way. Take, for example, figures like Tom Horn, a man whose life seems almost engineered to resist simple moral categorization. Former soldier, scout, detective, and eventually a contract killer operating under the loose banner of law enforcement. Horn was highly skilled, intelligent, and methodical. He was also terrifyingly comfortable with violence. His employers praised his efficiency. His critics accused him of murder disguised as justice. Both descriptions were accurate. Horn did not chase criminals out of ideological devotion. He chased outcomes. He believed strongly in deterrence, and he believed even more strongly that fear was an effective tool. If people were afraid of what might happen to them, they would behave. If they did not behave, the consequences would speak loudly enough for others to listen. This was not philosophy. It was pragmatism sharpened into a weapon. What made Horn unsettling was not that he enjoyed killing, but that he justified it so cleanly. Violence to him was not emotional, it was procedural, a step in a process, and processes, once internalized, are very difficult to question. Then there were hunters driven primarily by money, men whose motivations were refreshingly honest, if morally thin. They did not speak of order or justice. They spoke of risk and reward. A higher bounty justified greater danger. A lower bounty was ignored. This market logic turned crime into inventory. Targets were assessed, prioritized, and pursued like investments. Some of these hunters became notorious for chasing even the smallest rewards with ruthless determination, not because the money was significant, but because volume mattered. One bounty led to another. A reputation for persistence kept the work flowing, And once a man's livelihood depended entirely on the existence of fugitives, a strange dependency formed. They hunted criminals, as one observer dryly noted, but they lived because criminals kept existing. It is an uncomfortable realization. The system required crime to sustain itself. Total peace would have put bounty hunters out of work. Stability would have ended their relevance. Whether consciously or not, their survival depended on an endless supply of disorder. And then there were the deeply conflicted ones, the hunters who oscillated between restraint and brutality, who showed mercy one day and none the next. These were often men who started with ideals and lost them gradually. Each compromise seemed small at the time. Each shortcut felt justified by circumstance. Over time, the accumulation of these choices reshaped them. Psychologically, bounty hunting exerted a unique pressure. Constant pursuit fosters obsession. Living by rewards fosters calculation. Carrying lethal authority without oversight fosters entitlement. Many hunters began to see themselves not just as enforcers, but as arbiters, deciders, people who knew better than courts, better than communities, better than anyone who questioned them. Power, especially unchecked power, is intoxicating. It creates a feedback loop. Success reinforces confidence. Confidence encourages risk. Risk, when rewarded, erodes restraint. And soon the hunter no longer responds to the system. The system responds to him. This is how legends form. Stories began to circulate about hunters who never missed, who never failed, who always brought their targets back one way or another. Details were exaggerated. Context was stripped away. The messy reality of mistaken identity and collateral damage faded behind a simpler narrative of strength and resolve. Communities repeated these stories with a mixture of awe and relief. As long as someone else was feared more than the criminals, people felt safer. Fear, it turns out, is transferable. The frontier did not eliminate it, it redirected it. But admiration always had limits. The same traits that made these hunters effective also made them dangerous to tolerate long term. A man who answers only to money and reputation does not easily return. Authority to institutions. Some notorious bounty hunters eventually clashed with sheriffs, judges, and even the communities that once supported them. When control shifts too far into private hands, tension becomes inevitable. Ethically, these figures force uncomfortable questions. Can violence be justified if it produces stability? Does intention matter if outcomes are positive? At what point does necessity become excuse? The frontier did not debate these questions openly. It lived them, often painfully, and moved on. Late at night in quiet rooms, some bounty hunters reportedly reflected on their choices. Others drank, others doubled down. Rationalization is easier than reckoning, especially when society benefits from not asking too many questions. There is a subtle tragedy in the lives of these men. Many were products of instability themselves. War veterans, orphans, failures by conventional standards. The frontier offered them a role, a purpose, and a way to turn violence into validation. That opportunity was both empowering and corrosive. When their stories ended, they rarely did so cleanly. Some were killed, some were imprisoned, some faded into obscurity as the world around them changed. The system that elevated them eventually outgrew them. Professional law enforcement expanded. Courts strengthened, oversight increased, the space for freelance justice shrank. but the legends remained. And perhaps that is the most telling legacy. We remember these bounty hunters not because they embodied justice, but because they embodied a moment when justice was improvisational, when society was willing to accept deeply flawed individuals as solutions to deeply frightening problems. Their lives reveal a central paradox of the Wild West. Order was pursued through disorder. Stability was enforced through instability. And the people tasked with restoring balance were themselves profoundly unbalanced by the role. So were they driven by money? Undoubtedly. By fame? Often. By a craving for power? More than most would admit. Human motivation is rarely singular. It accumulates, shifts, and adapts to opportunity. What is certain is this: they did not operate in a vacuum. They were shaped by a system that rewarded speed over fairness, decisiveness over accuracy, and results over reflection. To judge them without judging that system would be incomplete. And yet, as famous as these hunters became, their stories represent only one side of the equation. Because for every hunter whose name survived, there were countless others whose names were erased. Because if someone is being hunted, someone is being chased. And that is where the story turns its gaze next. When being hunted became a profession. Every system that creates hunters also creates prey. And in the Wild West, the prey did not remain passive for long. Once bounties became common, once wanted posters became permanent decorations rather than temporary notices, a strange reversal began to occur. Being hunted was no longer a short chapter in someone's life. For many, it became a condition. For some, it became a skill. And for a few, it became something close to a profession. To live with a bounty on your head was to live without stillness. Sleep was shallow and temporary. Names became disposable. Faces were liabilities. You learned quickly that familiarity was dangerous and consistency was fatal. Staying in one place too long meant becoming predictable, and predictability was an invitation. The first thing a wanted person lost was identity. Names were abandoned or altered. Accents softened or exaggerated depending on the audience. Histories were rewritten on the fly. You learned to answer to whatever name someone called you, as long as it wasn't the wrong one. Paperwork, when it existed at all, was forged, borrowed, or stolen. A past became something to hide rather than explain. The second thing they lost was rest. Sleep, when it came, was fragmented. Every sound mattered. Footsteps outside a door, horses settling at night, a knock that came too hard, too confidently. You slept with exits planned and weapons within reach, not because you wanted to fight, but because surrender was rarely offered as an option. And the third thing they lost was certainty. You could do everything right and still be found. You could do nothing wrong and still be chased. The system did not require ongoing guilt. It required only that, at some point, you had been labeled. You don't need to commit a crime today, the frontier seemed to whisper. You just need to have done something once. This reality reshaped behavior. People with bounties learned to move in ways that avoided attention without inviting suspicion. They traveled with crowds when possible and avoided them when necessary. They paid in cash, quickly, and without complaint. They never asked too many questions, and they never answered them honestly. Some became experts at misdirection. They spread rumors about their own movements, deliberately leaving false trails. They allowed themselves to be seen heading one way while quietly arranging to go another. They exaggerated their own reputations, hoping to intimidate less confident hunters into backing off. Fear, after all, worked both ways. Others chose isolation, remote work, dangerous terrain, places where bounty hunters were less willing to follow. Mountains, deserts, border regions where authority dissolved into confusion. These were not safe places, but they were unpredictable places, and unpredictability was protection. And then there were those who did something truly ironic. They hired protection. Former lawmen, retired soldiers, local toughs, anyone who could discourage pursuit or delay confrontation long enough to escape. In some cases, wanted men paid, other wanted men to watch their backs. The hunted hiring the almost hunters to ward off the hunters. The logic was circular, but it was effective. This created a shadow economy of survival skills. Information became currency. Knowing which bounty hunters were active, which were ruthless, which preferred dead targets, and which could be reasoned with, was invaluable. Saloon conversations were mined carefully. Glances were analyzed. Silence was interpreted. Being hunted required constant psychological calculation. Trust became a resource too expensive to spend lightly. Friendships were temporary. Loyalty was tested repeatedly. Every kindness was weighed against the possibility of betrayal. Not everyone who smiled was a threat, but anyone could be. And yet, within this paranoia, some people adapted remarkably well. They developed routines that minimized risk. They learned to read environments instinctively. They understood how bounty hunters thought because they had been watching them for years. In a twisted way, they became experts in the very system designed to destroy them. This expertise did not make life easier. It made it survivable. The emotional toll, however, was constant. Living as a permanent target erodes empathy. It teaches you to prioritize yourself absolutely because no one else will. Over time, this self-focus could curdle into bitterness, suspicion, and cruelty. When every interaction feels like a threat, morality becomes situational. The frontier did not care why someone had a bounty. It did not distinguish well between violent criminals and people caught in bureaucratic mistakes, personal vendettas, or exaggerated accusations. Once listed, everyone played by the same rules, or rather by the same lack of rules. Families of the hunted suffered quietly. They moved frequently. They changed names. They learned not to ask questions. Children grew up understanding that silence was safety and curiosity was dangerous. Entire lives were shaped around avoiding a single piece of paper nailed to a wall. There is something deeply unsettling about how normal this became. Communities accepted that some people would live permanently on the run, not because they were actively dangerous, but because the system had no off switch. Once a bounty existed, removing it required effort, coordination, and goodwill, resources that were often in short supply. In rare cases, people cleared their names, evidence surfaced, witnesses spoke, posters were taken down. But relief did not arrive instantly. Hunters did not always get the message. Some did not care. A bounty once removed still lingered in memory, and memory could be just as lethal as ink. This meant that even innocence offered limited protection. Survival depended less on truth than on timing. The irony of the system reveals itself here with painful clarity. Bounty hunting was intended to isolate criminals. Instead, It created a class of people permanently disconnected from stability, a population defined not by what they were doing, but by what they once had been accused of doing. This disconnection had consequences. People who live outside the law for long enough stop believing the law will ever protect them. They begin to see authority as a threat rather than a safeguard. And when that happens, reintegration becomes nearly impossible. The hunted learned that compliance did not guarantee safety. Cooperation did not guarantee mercy. The rational response was avoidance. If the system could not distinguish between guilt and convenience, then the safest place was always just beyond its reach. Late at night, as they moved from place to place, the hunted carried a particular kind of exhaustion. Not just physical fatigue, but moral fatigue. The weariness of constantly being evaluated, measured, priced. The knowledge that somewhere, someone might be calculating whether your life was worth the trouble. And this is where the broader damage becomes visible. When anyone can become a target, trust erodes at every level. People become cautious with strangers, neighbors, even friends. Fear spreads sideways, not just downward. Communities fracture quietly. A society built on constant pursuit eventually turns inward. The mechanisms designed to remove threats begin to redefine what a threat looks like. And once that happens, the distinction between hunter and hunted becomes dangerously thin, because when survival depends on staying ahead of the system starts to consume itself. The Wild West, a land of gray zones. By the time bounty hunting became routine rather than remarkable, the Wild West had quietly transformed into something far more unsettling than simple lawlessness. It became a place where definitions dissolved, where categories blurred, and where moral certainty eroded under constant pressure. This was not a world divided cleanly between good men and bad men, or between law and chaos. It was a world composed almost entirely of gray zones, layered so thickly that no single line could be trusted to hold. In theory, the frontier still believed in justice. In practice, justice had become negotiable. The difference mattered less each year. The most dangerous transformation was not the rise of violence, but the collapse of clarity. When bounty hunting entered everyday life, it quietly dismantled the idea that right and wrong could be separated by procedure. Instead, outcomes became the standard. If a problem disappeared, the method used to remove it was rarely examined. Order was judged by absence, not by fairness. The hunter and the criminal began to resemble each other in uncomfortable ways. Both traveled armed. Both relied on speed and surprise. Both operated across borders without permission. Both used fear as leverage. The primary difference was not behavior, but approval. One had a poster. The other was on it. And approval, it turned out, was temporary. Sheriffs sometimes collaborated with bounty hunters, sometimes competed with them, and sometimes resented them openly. Judges, when present, struggled to assert authority over cases that arrived already resolved. Town councils appreciated the results while quietly fearing the precedent. Everyone understood that control was slipping, but no one wanted to be the first to give up the advantages this system provided. This is how blurred systems survive. Each participant benefits just enough to tolerate the cost. The question of whether bounty hunting preserved order or prolonged violence is difficult precisely because the answer is both. In some cases, it removed genuinely dangerous individuals who would have continued harming others. In many cases, it escalated conflicts, turned rumors into death sentences, and normalized lethal force as the fastest solution available. The frontier did not choose between safety and morality. It chose immediacy. There is a dry, almost absurd humor in recognizing how casually society accepted this arrangement, a system where justice arrived fastest when delivered at gunpoint, where efficiency was measured in silence rather than truth, where speed replaced scrutiny as the highest virtue. It would be funny if it were not so effective. The absence of boundaries created psychological fatigue. People stopped trying to categorize actions as right or wrong and began categorizing them as useful or inconvenient. This shift may seem subtle, but it reshaped everything. Violence committed for the right reason became acceptable. Violence committed without permission became unforgivable. Intent mattered less than alignment. In such an environment, moral language shrank. Words like fairness and accountability lost urgency. Words like necessary and inevitable took their place. When violence is framed as unavoidable, responsibility becomes abstract. The hunted internalized this logic as well. Many no longer asked whether the system was just. They asked only whether it could be avoided. Survival replaced vindication. Escape replaced explanation. This was not cowardice, it was adaptation. And adaptation, when widespread, becomes culture. Children grew up watching adults navigate this ambiguity. They learned early that authority was situational and protection conditional. They learned that being right did not guarantee safety, and being wrong did not guarantee punishment. They learned to read power rather than rules. The Wild West is often remembered as a place of bold individualism. In reality, it was a place of constant negotiation. Negotiation between fear and necessity, between ideals and reality, between what people claimed to believe and what they were willing to accept. Bounty hunting exposed this negotiation relentlessly. Every poster was a reminder that justice had a price. Every hunt was a reminder that enforcement depended on who was willing to act. Every mistake was a reminder that there was no clean way to fix a system built on shortcuts. And yet, dismantling the system felt impossible. Removing bounty hunting would have required replacing it with something slower, more expensive, and less immediately reassuring. It would have required patience in a culture addicted to urgency. It would have required trust in institutions that were still forming. So the gray zones remained. Over time, these zones expanded until they touched nearly every aspect of life. Business disputes escalated into legal threats backed by violence. Personal grudges found legitimacy through accusations. Political conflicts hid behind posters and payments. The system did not discriminate between motivations. It processed them all the same. The unsettling truth is that many people preferred it this way. Ambiguity offered flexibility. It allowed communities to act decisively without fully confronting the consequences. It allowed individuals to justify actions they might otherwise have questioned. It allowed society to function without fully agreeing on what justice meant. Late at night, when the streets quieted and the posters fluttered softly, the frontier revealed its true character. Not heroic, not evil, just unstable, a place constantly balancing on the edge of its own compromises. The humor that emerged from this environment was dry, almost resigned. "This is a system," someone once remarked, "where justice arrives fastest with a gun." It was said with a smile, but the smile did not reach the eyes. Everyone understood what was being acknowledged. Speed had replaced deliberation. Force had replaced consensus. And systems built on speed rarely pause to reflect. Eventually, the accumulation of these contradictions began to feel heavy. The stories grew darker, the mistakes harder to ignore, the legends less comforting. People started noticing patterns that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. History, slowly and quietly, began to shift its posture. What once felt necessary began to feel excessive. What once felt pragmatic began to feel dangerous. The gray zones, once tolerated, began to look like warning signs. And that is when the Wild West, for all its confidence and improvisation, started to feel wrong even to those who had built it. The decline of classic bounty hunting. Nothing in history ends with a single gunshot. Not eras, not systems, not habits. They fade, they thin out, they lose their dominance quietly while pretending to remain relevant. The decline of classic bounty hunting followed this pattern exactly. There was no dramatic announcement, no final poster torn down in symbolic triumph. Instead, the world around it slowly changed, and bounty hunting found itself increasingly out of place. The frontier did not disappear, but it matured. Towns stopped being temporary. Railroads stabilized movement. Trade demanded predictability. Families demanded safety that lasted longer than a single night. And most importantly, governments began to understand that improvisation could not scale forever. Institutions grew teeth. Courts became permanent rather than symbolic. Judges stayed longer than a season. Laws were written with clearer language and broader jurisdiction. Law enforcement evolved from individual figures into organized forces. Salaries improved. Training existed. Oversight, however imperfect, became a reality rather than an afterthought. This shift did not happen because society suddenly discovered morality. It happened because instability became expensive. Businesses needed consistency. Investors disliked chaos. Governments realized that outsourcing violence indefinitely undermined their legitimacy. The same logic that once justified bounty hunting now worked against it. If justice was a service, then the state needed to be its primary provider. Bounty hunters did not vanish overnight. They were squeezed. Their authority narrowed. Their actions were questioned. Their methods, once tolerated, were now scrutinized. Crossing borders without permission became harder. Killing suspects without trials became politically inconvenient. The ambiguity that once protected them slowly evaporated. Some adapted. They rebranded themselves as private investigators, security contractors, law enforcement auxiliaries. Their skills were absorbed into formal systems, stripped of autonomy, wrapped in regulation. Others resisted, clinging to old habits in a world that no longer welcomed them. These were the ones most likely to clash with the new order. The bounty hunter, once a symbol of frontier necessity, began to look like a liability. And yet the profession did not disappear completely. It mutated. In some regions, bounty hunting remained legal but heavily restricted. Warrants replaced posters. Rules defined pursuit. Oversight followed action. The freelancer became a subcontractor. The hunter became accountable. Efficiency was still valued, but not at any cost. This transformation felt like progress, but it came with discomfort. Regulations slowed things down. Procedures complicated outcomes. Cases dragged on. Justice became less dramatic and more bureaucratic. And while this was safer, it was also less satisfying to a population accustomed to swift resolutions. There is a quiet irony here. As systems improved, nostalgia grew. Stories of the old days became simpler, cleaner, more heroic. The messiness was edited out. The brutality softened. What remained was a myth of decisiveness in an age that increasingly felt constrained by paperwork and delays. The spirit of bounty hunting survived in this myth. Even as classic bounty hunting declined, the underlying desire it fulfilled remained very much alive. The desire for quick solutions, the desire for visible action, the desire to bypass complexity in favor of results. These impulses did not vanish with the frontier. They followed society into modernity. Late at night, when frustration with institutions grew, people still asked familiar questions. Why is this taking so long? Why can't someone just handle it? Why does justice feel so slow? These questions echo the same impatience that once nailed posters to walls. The old system faded because it was dangerous, not because it was ineffective. It solved problems quickly, but it created new ones just as fast. The modern state learned that speed without restraint erodes trust, and trust is harder to rebuild than order. Still, something was lost. The bounty hunter represented clarity, however brutal. A problem was named, a price was set, an outcome followed. In contrast, modern justice often feels abstract, delayed, and unsatisfying. It demands faith in processes rather than confidence in individuals. This tension explains why the idea of the bounty hunter never truly dies. It retreats into fiction. It resurfaces in different forms. It adapts to new contexts. But the core appeal remains the same. Action over hesitation. The decline of classic bounty hunting was not a moral awakening. It was an administrative necessity. Governments needed legitimacy. Economies needed stability. Violence needed boundaries. And so the wild edges were trimmed. But trimming is not erasing. The frontier taught society a dangerous lesson, that justice could be purchased, delegated, and accelerated. Once learned, such lessons are difficult to forget. They resurface whenever systems feel slow or inadequate. And so, even as the old posters yellowed and fell, even as guns were replaced by documents and procedures, the impulse remained. The belief that somewhere, someone should be able to act quickly, decisively, and without too many questions. Because while the classic bounty hunter faded into history, the world never stopped craving solutions that were fast, clean, and conveniently final. And that is why this story does not truly end here. The mad legacy in modern culture. Long after the last classic wanted posters were torn down, long after the frontier hardened into infrastructure and paperwork, bounty hunters refused to stay buried in history. They re-emerged somewhere safer, somewhere cleaner, somewhere far more flattering. They re-emerged in stories, in movies, in television, in video games, in places where consequences could be edited, Morality could be simplified, and violence could be framed as entertainment rather than disruption. Modern culture did not just remember bounty hunters, it redesigned them. On screen, the bounty hunter is rarely tired, rarely confused, and almost never wrong. They are sharp, witty, emotionally complex, but morally centered. They operate outside the law, yes, but always for the right reasons. Their targets are unmistakably guilty. Their shots are precise. Their mistakes are forgivable, often charming. Collateral damage rarely lingers long enough to feel uncomfortable. This version is seductive. Films frame bounty hunters as rebels with purpose, lone professionals navigating corrupt systems with clarity the audience envies. Games turn them into skill trees and upgrades, stripping pursuit down to mechanics and rewards. Television gives them long arcs, backstories, redemption. The frontier's ambiguity is replaced with narrative certainty. The messiness is gone. In reality, bounty hunting thrived precisely because nothing was clear. Guilt was uncertain, authority was fractured, violence was unpredictable. Most real hunts were tense, ugly, and deeply unsatisfying. But those realities are difficult to package. They interrupt pacing, they complicate heroes, they raise questions no one came to be entertained by. So fiction trims the edges. In popular culture, bounty hunters rarely hunt the wrong person. When they do, it becomes a meaningful character moment rather than a permanent tragedy. The weight of irreversible mistakes is softened by music cues and dialogue. Death is dramatic, not administrative. Justice feels earned, not outsourced. The irony is hard to miss. We admire bounty hunters most when they are furthest from what they actually were, and this admiration reveals something uncomfortable about modern taste. We crave decisiveness. We romanticize autonomy. We enjoy watching individuals bypass slow systems to achieve clean outcomes. The bounty hunter becomes a vessel for these desires. They act when institutions hesitate. They simplify when reality complicates. We like them better on screen than in real life, someone once remarked, and the observation holds. Real bounty hunters disrupt stability. Fictional ones restore it within 2 hours or less. The contrast between reality and representation is stark. Real bounty hunting depended on incomplete information, uneven skill, and questionable incentives. Fictional bounty hunting depends on clarity, competence, and moral alignment. One thrives on ambiguity. The other eliminates it. This transformation is not accidental. It is cultural self-defense. Modern societies are deeply procedural. Decisions pass through committees, reviews, appeals. Outcomes are delayed. Accountability is layered. While this structure protects against abuse, it also feels slow and impersonal. Fiction offers relief. It compresses justice into a shape that feels emotionally satisfying. The bounty hunter is perfect for this role. They symbolize action without bureaucracy, consequences without deliberation, resolution without waiting. In a world frustrated by complexity, that image is powerful, but it is also dishonest. When we romanticize bounty hunters, we retroactively justify systems that thrived on fear and haste. We forget the innocent lives disrupted. We forget the normalization of lethal error. We forget how easily authority slipped into private hands and how difficult it was to retrieve. Modern culture does not celebrate bounty hunting as it was. It celebrates bounty hunting as we wish it had been. This selective memory extends beyond entertainment. Language itself borrows from the frontier. We talk about bringing someone in, about tracking down problems, about targets and clean solutions. These metaphors carry the old logic forward, stripped of context. Even today, when societies face crises, the temptation resurfaces. Find the threat, assign responsibility, act quickly, ask fewer questions. The frontier mindset has not vanished. It has been abstracted. The unsettling part is how easily this abstraction feels reasonable. When systems feel slow or ineffective, decisive figures regain appeal. We forgive shortcuts when outcomes align with our fears. We overlook complexity when clarity is promised. This is the true legacy of bounty hunting. Not the profession itself, but the mindset it normalized. Entertainment amplifies this mindset because it rewards emotional payoff. Justice delivered at the right moment feels good. Moral ambiguity resolved decisively feels comforting. Watching someone else make hard choices spares us from making them ourselves. But comfort is not accuracy. The real Wild West was not resolved by lone figures cleaning up chaos. It was stabilized by institutions, regulation, and restraint. These forces lack cinematic appeal, but they endure. They do not fit neatly into hero narratives, but they prevent the need for heroes in the first place. Still, the image persists. The lone hunter, the clean shot, the solved problem. We return to it because it promises simplicity in a world that feels increasingly complex. And perhaps that is the final irony. The more structured society becomes, the more it fantasizes about unstructured solutions. The more rules exist, the more appealing rule breakers feel, as long as they break them on our behalf. The bounty hunter polished by fiction becomes a symbol of controlled rebellion. Dangerous, but only to the deserving. Independent, but aligned with our values. This version is safe to admire precisely because it no longer exists. History, however, remembers the original more clearly. It remembers the cost of speed, the price of ambiguity, the lives bent and broken by systems that valued results over process. It remembers how easily justice can be reshaped into something unrecognizable when fear leads and restraint follows. And this is where the story circles back. Because beneath the myths, beneath the nostalgia, beneath the entertainment, the same question lingers quietly, waiting to be asked again. When justice feels slow, how much chaos are we willing to accept to make it faster? Justice, money, and the human cost. At the very beginning of this story, a simple question was asked, almost casually, as if it were harmless. If the law arrives late, who arrives first? It sounded like a historical curiosity then, a rhetorical doorway into a distant world of dust and gunfire. But by now, after following the trail through fear, money, violence, myth, and memory, that question no longer feels safely locked in the past. It feels uncomfortably current. The Wild West, as a place and a period, eventually ended. Railroads connected distances. Governments extended their reach. Courts stabilized. The posters came down. The guns were holstered, at least in theory. The frontier, once defined by improvisation, was absorbed into structure. History closed that chapter with a sense of relief and a quiet promise that things would be different from now on. But ideas do not retire when environments change. They adapt. They wait. The idea at the heart of bounty hunting was not about horses or revolvers. It was about outsourcing responsibility, about converting uncertainty into transaction, about answering fear with payment rather than patience. The Wild West did not invent this idea. It simply practiced it openly, without apology. When people paid others to hunt on their behalf, they were not abandoning morality. They were postponing it. They were saying, solve this problem first. We'll ask questions later. That logic, once normalized, becomes very difficult to contain. Because the truth is, the frontier mindset never disappeared. It learned new vocabulary, new uniforms, new justifications. But it still surfaces whenever systems feel slow, when procedures feel burdensome, when complexity feels threatening. We still live in a world that quietly asks, how much would it cost to make this go away? We still reward speed over reflection, outcomes over processes, silence over understanding. We still feel relief when someone else handles the mess, especially if it means we don't have to look too closely at how. The Wild West showed us what happens when justice is priced instead of practiced. It showed us how quickly ethics bend when efficiency is rewarded. It showed us how violence becomes administrative when responsibility is dispersed. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it showed us how easily ordinary people accept extraordinary arrangements when fear is persuasive enough. There is a dry irony in how familiar this all feels. The setting has changed. The weapons are subtler. The posters are digital. But the underlying impulse remains recognizable. Find the threat, assign a value, accelerate the outcome, reduce the discomfort. Late at night, when distractions fade, it becomes easier to see the continuity. The Wild West was not an anomaly. It was an early experiment, a rough draft of a recurring human pattern. We want justice. We also want convenience. When forced to choose, we often pretend we don't notice the trade-off. History does not condemn the frontier for its desperation. It observes it. It notes how systems built under pressure tend to favor immediacy, how morality becomes negotiable when survival feels uncertain, how power flows toward those willing to act without hesitation. The bounty hunter, stripped of myth, was not a hero or a villain. He was a mirror. He reflected what society was willing to tolerate, excuse, and reward at that moment. When fear was high, his methods were acceptable. When stability returned, they became embarrassing. The same actions, reinterpreted by a different context. And that should give us pause. Because progress is not measured only by what we stop doing, but by what we resist repeating. The frontier teaches us that once justice becomes transactional, it rarely stays contained. It leaks, it spreads, it reshapes expectations, it conditions people to accept shortcuts as normal. Even today we feel the temptation. When systems feel slow, we ask for faster ones. When rules feel inconvenient, we look for exceptions. When accountability feels complicated, we prefer delegation. We may no longer call it bounty hunting, but the instinct to pay someone else to resolve moral tension persists. The Wild West ended, but the mindset that sustained it learned how to dress better. And so we return quietly to the opening question. Not as a historical exercise, but as a personal one. If the law arrives late, who do we invite to act first? And more importantly, what do we give up when we let them? The frontier believed it was buying safety. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it bought silence instead. Sometimes it bought mistakes that could never be corrected. The receipt was rarely itemized. The cost was distributed unevenly. Those who paid were not always those who suffered. Justice, when priced, becomes selective. It serves those who can afford it and burdens those who cannot. It favors speed over care, resolution over truth. And once it becomes a service, it invites competition, escalation, and abuse. This is not a lesson confined to dusty towns and fading posters. It is a lesson that waits patiently for moments of frustration and fear, ready to be relearned. So as the music fades, as the images of the frontier dissolve into darkness, the question remains, suspended, unresolved, deliberately uncomfortable. When justice has a price, who is the one who truly pays?